77 лет, где-то в пакете написала письмо. У меня жена читала, плакала. Она много грузов передала. Тут баба Оля есть. Я вам говорю, вообще, она и душу сюда бы свою отдала, если бы могла.
There was not yet a single war in which the average civilian could influence the outcome of a conflict. In the spring and summer of 2014, the Ukrainian volunteer movement dressed most of the military units. When it was necessary, these volunteers sent care packages to the soldiers defending Ukraine in the east containing food, water, warm clothing, building materials, and other bare necessities. It was the period when volunteer groups and charitable foundations were formed, and their main objective was to raise donations to support our brave soldiers. Contacts were established with powerful businessmen and politicians and became trendy to help the soldiers of the Ukrainian army. A strategic approach allowed the army to supply transport vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles, and even modern weaponry. This is the 10th episode of the film about ATO, History of War. Our objective is to try and understand the course of events of the ATO in the east of Ukraine and its cause and effect. What does the Russian Federation have to do with all this? And how does the conflict between Ukraine and Russia pose a threat to Europe? On June 20, 2014, the first truce was announced in the Donbass. As of December 2017, the High Command of the military staff had given an order to observe the ceasefire more than 30 times. However, a genuine truce lasted no longer than one day. The lack of unity of the command staff by the militants produced the same result. Despite the agreements, there was always one middle-rank commander who was trigger-happy and was always willing to open fire. In response, Ukrainian soldiers were given the command and the right to return fire. And very often, the so-called regime of silence or ceasefire remained a dead letter. Peace is the goal of any war. Sometimes, in order to achieve peace, to suspend hostilities or prevent them from the beginning, it is enough to conduct authorized negotiations. There were examples of this in world history. The Cuban Missile Crisis 1962 is one such example. The lack of normal communication between US President John F. Kennedy and the head of the Soviet Union Nikita Khrushchev mostly led the world to a potential nuclear war. To avoid such a situation, the leaders of the two superpowers were put into contact with each other through a special line of communication, the so-called Red Phone. Military operations and destruction in the Donbass are not profitable mainly for Ukraine. On June 23rd, the first meeting of the contact group on issues of peaceful settlement of the conflict was held in Donetsk. The negotiations took place under the supervision of the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, OSCE. Leonid Kuchma, president of Ukraine from 1994 to 2005, represented Ukraine at these negotiations. According to the OSCE protocol, Viktor Medvedchuk, former first vice speaker of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, represented the interests of the DPR and the LPR. At the meeting, there were former VR People's Deputy Oleg Tsarov and the so-called Prime Minister of the DPR Major General of the Russian Federation Alexander Borodai. Despite Putin's statements about non-participation of Russian soldiers in the conflict, the Russian ambassador to Ukraine, Mikhail Zurabov, also participated in the talks. The president of Ukraine proposed a plan for a peaceful resolution. The rebels were asked to lay down their arms. For those Ukrainian citizens who didn't commit any serious crimes, amnesty was guaranteed, and for citizens of the Russian Federation, a safe corridor for returning home. Protection of the Russian language and elections to local authorities were declared. Changes to the constitution of Ukraine were also proposed. But the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation called this plan an ultimatum. The pro-Russian puppet government of the east of Ukraine announced that they did not consider the president of Ukraine legitimate and refused to cooperate. Although during negotiations in Donetsk, they managed to agree on a ceasefire until June 27th, which de facto did not happen. The next day, the shelling resumed and 13 Ukrainian officers were killed on June 24th. Near Slavyansk, as a result of the attacks, an Mi-8 helicopter and an infantry fighting vehicle were destroyed. In the latter case, the IFV with its crew was destroyed by an anti-tank missile that was directed from Russian territory. The shelling of Ukrainian troops from the territory of the Russian Federation would soon become massive and methodical. In August, the Russian artillery boasted about their successes in social networks. The Ukrainian military, unable to respond to this fire, suffered irreplaceable losses. The leadership of the Russian Federation was looking for any reasons to bring in troops, and any Ukrainian projectile that hit the territory of Russia would become such a precept. Russian propaganda attempted to blame the Ukrainian army for shelling the territory of the Russian Federation. But in the internet, there was video information about the work of artillery from the bordering Russian city of Gukovo. Exactly that became one of the facts of aggression.
Вот так вот весело в городе Гуково, ребята!
In the meantime, it turned out that there were much more soldiers in the Ukrainian army than those registered on the draft list. There were significantly more than Russian intelligence could have imagined. A kind of phenomenon appeared, which the Russian Federation did not encounter, either during the Chechen wars or in Georgia. Volunteers, ordinary civilians, and far from law enforcement agencies came together to help the Ukrainian army. Let's start with the terminology. A volunteer is a person who voluntarily, at his or her own expense, is engaged in gratuitous, socially beneficial activities. But a person who comes to the military enlistment office voluntarily without a call to duty is also considered a volunteer. But applying this term to the Russian-Ukrainian war, it has assumed a different meaning. A volunteer is a person who helps the army. Here and further on, this term will be used only in this interpretation and context. Raise money and purchase a uniform? Transfer it to the unit where the neighbor serves. No problem. Buy and send to the front a night vision device? Here you are. Give your automobile to the troops? It may be a sacrifice, but what other way is there? After all, citizens who don't help their armed forces defending the country will then be forced to feed foreigners. The organization Maidan in the city of Kremenchuk gave us this ready-to-go military vehicle. It was prepared especially for Secret Service men. Now we're going to the city of Slavyansk. We'll leave at night and we'll arrive there in the morning. Then we'll be able to give humanitarian aid supplies to our troops. Since the spring of 2014, various assistance care packages were brought to the army and volunteer units from all regions of the country. As it turned out, everything was needed: ordinary underwear, pants, socks and shirts, military equipment, and state-of-the-art surveillance devices. Due to the previous leadership of the country, the army at the beginning of the war was very poorly supplied. Later, the problem of properly supplying and financing the armed forces was finally resolved at the legislative level.
Здравствуйте.
Здорово, друже.
Сосредоточилась на...
We focused on the garment industry. It was necessary to start the work quickly. I had experience. For the best logistics, we chose the company that was the nearest. We managed in about a half a year to transform completely into a so-called military footing. The leadership helped as they had to stay alert during the crisis, and we needed to sew as many uniforms as possible. We sewed pouches for ammunition and other military accessories. The fact is that a volunteer does not have enough time to make a decision when it comes to production of such accessories that the soldiers need today and even yesterday.
У него нет раздумий. Ему надо сегодня, ему надо на вчера.
Often the scheme was the same. First, the person passes on what is immediately available, but then, having exhausted their own resources, they turn to friends, and together they start buying expensive equipment. Those who possessed organizational skills created volunteer funds. They made contact with the commanders and passed on to the unit not just simple assistance, but often the necessary special equipment. And it was not always something military. The soldiers were also in desperate need of a common everyday tool or some building materials. With the help of social networks announcing their needs, volunteer groups prepared care packages of such accessories and basic goods to send to the front to help our soldiers.
By
the end of 2017, we managed to raise more than $5 million in the equivalent to the Ukrainian currency. We raised more than $5 million and sent to the soldiers on the front more than 80 thermal imagers. We made there an artillery fire control system, which is resistant to electronic warfare. We installed the navigation aids on half of the Air Force fleet and installed radar systems on 3 of the aircraft. We trained more than 100 sappers, snipers, and artillerymen, and we continue to do so. The fact of transferring assistance was preserved in photos shot on a standard camera. Demonstrating these photos in social networks, volunteers could publicly report to sponsors. All the money contributed was spent on the needs of the Ukrainian army, not to line somebody's pockets. This initiative of humanitarian aid greatly increased people's trust in volunteers. Afterwards, these people also became the alternative source of news from the battlefields. As for the battles, at the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, up to 30% of the wounded soldiers died, as they could not hold on until medical aid units reached them, though they could have been saved. At the same time, in the armies of NATO countries, the number of such cases is considerably lower. Tactical medicine is a set of knowledge and skills that can save lives on the battlefield, waiting time enough to transport the wounded soldiers to the nearest hospital. As it turned out, at the very beginning of the ATO, the notion of modern tactical medicine was unknown to the army. There was a request for various items and drugs that could save the life of a soldier wounded in battle. Emergency military tourniquets, bandages, and other means were delivered to the army only with the help of volunteers. Moreover, special instructors traveled to the units, teaching soldiers the basics of medicine. This work saved many soldiers' lives, in the truest sense. In 2014, the situation with medicine in the Ukrainian army was atrocious. It was the same as it pertained to clothing and weapons. There was nothing. It wasn't an exaggeration when doctors or regiment commanders said that they had absolutely nothing. On the list there were bandages, hydrogen peroxide, and analgin, headache tablets, the very bare necessities in terms of medical aid. Some of the divisions were very fortunate if they had wound dressings that were 30 years old.
І ППшки такого самого віку, це, їм пощастило.
At that time, there was no front line, and the zone controlled by the government troops was not always safe. The usual supply of food and water for the fighting units led to a problem caused by ambushes on the roads. Unlike military trucks, the usual vehicles used by volunteers were less noticeable on the roads of the Donbass region. Sometimes desperate civilians, risking their lives, toward the roadblocks of the separatist checkpoints and supply troops with everything that they could possibly need to keep on going. By the end of June, being a volunteer and helping the Ukrainian army became a very dangerous mission that in some cases was even fatal. Some of the terrorists were eager for easy prey. They took up arms only for the sake of looting and pillaging. During the week from June 16th to June 23rd, in Donetsk, more than 40 vehicles were stolen from the local residents by armed men in military uniforms. Any rebel could only dream about a vehicle full of expensive equipment or even food. In short, helping the soldiers of the Ukrainian army was a very risky business. Officially, the truce ended on June 27th, but then it was extended until June 1st. During this period, 10 soldiers were released from captivity and reserves were brought up to Slavyansk. Over these days, Ukraine lost 8 soldiers. Night battles became more frequent. So volunteer organizations and humanitarian aid foundations played a very key role in supplying soldiers of the Ukrainian army with night vision devices to help them fight in this new form of nocturnal combat. In early July 2014, the operation to surround the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration was nearing its end. As a result of the liberation of the cities of Chervony Liman and Yampil, the supply routes for militants were blocked, and the culmination was near. The days for the liberation of the cities were numbered.